Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and yes, that's right. We're back. We're back with the Truth Attack. We are the Liberty Works Radio Network, and we do need the support of the members of the listening audience to keep the broadcast network operating and the shows coming. So, if you enjoy the shows, the information, the topic, the lectures, the discussions, and the guests and the hosts on the other shows on the network, we sure would appreciate it if you could find your way over to the LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com website, if you're not already there listening online, and get signed up as a subscribing member, even if it's as little as $10, $20 a month. Every membership counts, and we do need the support of the listening audience to keep the network operating. And, of course, if you want to get fully informed on the maladministration, which has been exposed literally now as a complete and total constitutional fraud known as the income tax, and the IRS's enforcement of it, and the DOJ's enforcement of it in the federal courts, and in fact, the fraudulent enforcement of it by the federal courts, both district and circuit courts, where there has been an unaddressed rebellion of sedition going on that has exposed the constitutional fraud that has been perpetrated on the American people by the legal community, the judges and the lawyers too, I guess, for over 60 years, basically since World War II. The income tax, it turns out, is another one of those judicially invented constitutional frauds that this Supreme Court is getting rid of. And of course, all of these fraudulent decisions I'm referring to were enacted by lower courts or by the Supreme Court itself in the late 50s, early 60s, and early 70s as the court turned basically liberal socialist and began making things up that aren't in the Constitution in order to give the federal government more power. What am I talking about? Well, how about Roe v. Wade? That was a federal court, Supreme Court decision that invented a constitutional authority for the federal government over abortion. But medicine, health care, prescriptions, drugs, none of this is in the Constitution. Medicine is up to the states. Healthcare is up to the states. This is a state issue. Got nothing to do with the federal government, but the Supreme Court made it up in Roe v. Wade, and we've been stuck with the class warfare that bad decision created for what? 65 years now? 60 years? And we have, of course, affirmative action, another liberal court policy made up by the Supreme Court in the 60s and the 70s, a liberal court that decided the best solution and answer to past discrimination, historic discrimination in the past, was more discrimination in the future, just of a reverse nature. We'll discriminate against the other group now, and then we'll be even, because two wrongs make a right. Isn't that what they say? No, that's not what they say. I'm sorry. Well, that's what the Supreme Court did. It made up affirmative action as the solution to discrimination, more discrimination. And this court threw it out. Students from Harvard and North Carolina sued, and affirmative action got stricken down and tossed out. What else did the liberal court make up? Well, how about regulatory deference under Chevron, where the administrative bureaucracies were given the power by the Supreme Court, not of law, not by Congress, but by Supreme Court opinion, the power to make up law, basically, beyond that written by Congress. They were allowed to do this by creating regulations that made their job easy and the government more powerful at the expense of having to obey the statutes. They just made it up. Regulations can be used instead of statutes to control and rule the American people. And how have they misused that type of regulatory deference? Well, they made up liability under the regulations for Section 1 tax imposed when the statute doesn't say anything at all about tax imposed, because that would be a direct tax which was never enacted. But in order to support their claim that it was a non-apportioned direct tax under authority of the 16th Amendment, the IRS made up a regulation that says you're liable for the tax under Section 1. You work, you owe, you're liable, you have to pay. You're a slave. You're a slave. We're just not taking 100% because you know you have to eat and rent. If we took 100%, you'd kill us. But you're a slave. They're just not using the physical constraints of whips and chains. They're using the economic, financial, psychological constraints of extortion and threats of harm and danger. Erwin Schiff was right. It's the federal mafia. There's no liability for tax on your work. It was inconceivable to the founding fathers that every time an American worked, he would owe tax to the federal government. Inconceivable. That's a direct tax on the person by virtue of his taxing his labor. It's just like a capitation tax of $100 a head. If every time I work and earn $1, I owe you 30 cents. That's just nonsense. There's no profit in labor. It's an equal exchange of value for value. Blood, sweat, and tears, experience, reliability, honesty, dependability, consistency, reputation, all of these things go into the perceived value of one man's labor for an hour. And it's an equal exchange of value for value. There's no profit in an hourly wage. It's property for property. Work for an equivalent value of pay. And there's no taxability in it. Sources of gross income, of course, have been the foundational basis for the claim that you owe income tax as a direct non-apportioned tax. But sources are not a legitimate basis for indirect taxation under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. That allows basis only in impost, taxing foreign persons, foreign activity, foreign imports, and in foreign places, or duty, taxing exported goods, or excise, taxing commodities, licenses, and corporations. Labor isn't part of taxing indirectly by impost, duty, and excise. And sources of gross income don't make them taxable income when rent or interest or dividends or salaries or wages or commissions or annuities are earned by a citizen in the 50 states. That's direct taxation. That's why they have been using Section 61 to deceive you about believing that everything you did was taxable, and you accepted it because you were allowed your salaries and wages to be taxed through the W-4 that you put in, and thus creating that false and erroneous presumption of subjectivity to tax. The government takes advantage of you and enslaves you for the rest of your life. So the Supreme Court decision in Moore exposes the fact that income taxes are indirect taxes under Article 1, Section 8. They're not direct, non-apportioned tax on income. It's not a non-apportioned direct tax under the 16th Amendment. Every single element of that claim is wrong. It's not a direct tax, it's indirect. It's not a direct tax without limitation. It's an indirect tax with the limitation of uniformity, which itself has basically been thrown away, and I have a problem with that, which I've explained before, but it's an indirect tax in the form of impost, duty, and excise. There are no new powers created by the 16th Amendment. There are no new subjects created by the 16th Amendment. Before the 16th Amendment, citizens weren't subject to tax on their labor, their work, their rent, their interest, their dividends, all of their earnings earned by right from their labor or from their property, assets, and ownership of property. That's all earned by right outside of the federal territorial legislative prerogative. territorial and legislative prerogatives and ability to tax in that direct manner in like territories and possessions or in foreign countries under tax treaties, which when we research it is what we find the income tax is. It was originally enacted in 1913 under the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of October 3rd, 1913. A tariff is one form of an impost, and what we find in that Tariff Act is exactly what the Supreme Court tells us. The Act provides for collecting the tax at the source. That is, makes it the duty of the corporations, etc., to retain and pay the sum of the tax. What they're talking about, of course, is a tariff that requires any person or corporation who does business with a non-resident alien to withhold money as tax from payments made to those non-resident alien and foreign corporations, and then those withholding agents, the tax collectors who have collected money from the foreigners, send in the tax they've collected to the Treasury. It's a system of collection of the tax at the source, and they use the same system 32 years later in 1945 when they added the employers as a class of tax collectors who for the first time could collect tax from citizens, because withholding agents, the original tax collectors, weren't allowed to collect tax from citizens. They were limited to collecting from the foreign person subject to the Tariff Act. Citizens aren't subject to any tariff in the 50 states. And that's why the tax collectors weren't allowed to collect tax from citizens. And that's why they had to add a new class of collectors in 1945, i.e. the employers, because previous to the victory tax in World War II, employment wasn't part of the federal taxing powers. And the 16th Amendment didn't make it so, and it didn't start happening until the victory tax in World War II, which was, of course, an unconstitutional direct tax on the labor of the American people. But the federal government got away with it because of World War II. They pushed it as a patriotic duty to sacrifice to save the planet from the Nazis in the European theater and the Imperial Japanese in the Pacific. And it worked. They did it. Nobody complained. The American people paid the victory tax for 2 years, and when it expired, nobody had sued. And most of the war debt had already been paid off. Congress couldn't believe it and reenacted the legislation we're currently under, which does not impose a tax on your labor. That tax expired with the victory tax. The new law simply authorizes the employer to withhold money as tax wherever the employee asks for it and allows it on a W-4 by not claiming exempt. And you have the right to claim exempt because 3402N says that if you have no liability for tax under Subtitle A last year or this year, you can claim exempt on your W-4. And the only liability for tax in Subtitle A statutes is under 1461, which makes the withholding agents liable for the money they've collected from the foreign persons. And the fact that the taxpayers, the withholding agents, the people with the legal duty to interact with the Treasury, never pay tax out of their own pocket, but only turn over to the Treasury the tax they have collected from other persons. We have the classic shifting of the burden of the tax from the pocket of the taxpayer, the withholding agent, to the pocket of some other party, the foreign persons, from whom the tax is actually collected and paid by the collector. And we have exactly the same thing happening with the employment relationship. The employee isn't the taxpayer. The employer is the taxpayer because that's the party with the legal duty under the statutes who's made liable to pay the tax to the United States Treasury. The employee thinks they're the taxpayer because that's what the government wants you to think, and because it's their money that goes to the tax. But they have no legal duty to interact with the Treasury. Only the employer does. They allege the duty for the employee to interact comes out of a requirement to file a 1040, which doesn't exist in law, only de facto practice. Okay, I think I hear the first commercial break coming up. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. We do need the support of the listening audience to keep operating, so find your way over to the libertyworksradionetwork.com website and get signed up. We'll be back in 5 minutes with more. Yo. Okay, this is Thomas Fried on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and let's just get right back into it. As I was saying, the federal courts, the Supreme Court and the circuit courts, have foisted off on the American people over for 60 years a number of fraudulent liberal court decisions that made things up that aren't in the Constitution, that has created this bureaucratic nightmare. The income tax funds the ever expanding bureaucratic state, which empowers itself through making up regulations that control you, that go beyond the power of the statutes, that gives them authority to act with respect to you. So they're rewriting the law. Roe v. Wade was made up by the Supreme Court. They threw it out. Affirmative action was made up by the Supreme Court. They threw it out. Regulatory deference was made up by the Supreme Court 50 years ago. All of these decisions happened 50, 60 years ago. We've been stuck with the bad policy and the problematic population divide that they've created for 60 years because of what the liberal court did. And this court has decided the income tax is the same thing. It's not the non-apportioned direct tax on labor, and the ruling in Moore essentially leads us to the conclusion, inevitably, that there's been a fatal error made somewhere in the courts in its history, a fatal error like Roe v. Wade or Chevron or the affirmative action decisions. And I've identified what that fatal error in history was. It's the case of Glenshaw Glass v. Commissioner in 1955. This is the case where the Supreme Court takes Section 61 and describes how it comes out of Section 22 as a tax on all accessions to wealth, interest, rent, dividend, and it, of course, puts forth the foundational premise, the erroneous foundational premise, that the tax is a non-apportioned direct tax on income under the 16th Amendment on all sources of earnings of quote-unquote income, even though there's no profit in labor. But and did I forget to mention, salaries and wages aren't in Section 61. That was made up by this court. They just made it up. So that's the critical hole, the critical error in time is Glenshaw Glass v. Commissioner, 1955. And that's where the Supreme Court erred with respect to the income tax. So that's the case that needs to be attacked. And as I've explained, many times in the past. Part of the error that the Supreme Court made, beyond the assumption that it's a direct non-apportioned tax under the 16th Amendment, they made the fatal assumption, fatal error, of assuming that Section 22 was domestic legislation simply because it was in the statutes. And of course, anytime you're investigating the true legal effect of a statute, you have to go to the original legislation that it was enacted under. First, that usually gives you some insight as to the original congressional intent behind enacting the statute, but often it reveals an inherent limitation within the statute because of the nature and declarations made within the original legislation. So, what was the original legislation that Section 61 was enacted under? Was it part of the 1913 new income tax laws under the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of October 3rd, 1913? Was it part of the original income tax legislation? No. No, it wasn't. If you research Section 22A, which is where Section 61 came from when the law was recodified in 1954, well, what that means is recodified means to reorganize the statutes within the titles. What happens is as time goes by, more and more statutes accumulate and are passed by Congress and have to be put on the books. And you ultimately reach a point where you need to do a reorganization of the statutes. The statutes were reorganized in 1939, 1954, and 1986. So each time they recodify the statutes, there are a few statutes that change section number so that they are moved to the part of the title that they're in that is relevant to what the statute does, so that it's easier to research a particular issue or topic because the statutes are together. So Section 22A, which is what Section 61 came from when the law was recodified in 1954. So before 1954, Section 61 was 22A, which is why Glenshaw Glass talks about the statute moving from 22A to Section 61 and being a tax on the accession to wealth, which of course is nonsense. There's no such basis for any tax on accession to wealth that is indirect. That would have to be a direct tax, which was the erroneous premise that court was operating on. And Moore, the recent Supreme Court decision in June, exposes that foundational premise as being pure error. And the error is easy to see because when we research Section 22A, which was in the law from 1953 back to, it turns out, 1920, what we find is that Section 22A was enacted not in 1913, but 5 years later in 1918 in an entirely separate piece of legislation. And what was this piece of legislation that was enacted in 1918 that resulted in Section 22A appearing on the books in 1920, a year later? Because it took them that long to get statutes into the titles back then. It took a while to reorganize the stuff. But the original legislation the statute was enacted under was a Canadian tax treaty. It's listed as Part 519. It was a 75-year-long Canadian tax treaty that existed from 1918 to 1993. That was the original legislation Section 22A was enacted under. It didn't tax domestic sources of earnings. It never has. Glenshaw Glass made it up. They didn't research the original legislation, which takes you right to a Canadian tax treaty, which shows you the only time rent, dividend, interest, salaries, wages, compensation, annuities, commissions, etc., 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 the only time any of those things are made taxable as sources of gross income is when they were earned in Canada between 1918 and 1993, when the tax treaty expired. And when an original piece of legislation expires, all of the statutes that were enacted under that original legislation that were not later reenacted by Congress with a greater applicability at law than that provided by the original legislation, well, if they aren't given a further application at law, then when the original legislation expires and falls off the books, so too do all of the statutes enacted under that original legislation that weren't given greater applicability at law by Congress in the interim. And that is exactly what we find with Section 22A and Section 61. It was enacted in 1918. It was published as being applicable under Part 519, which is the Canadian Tax Treaty, not applicable under Part 1, which is the federal personal income tax, had no application there. It only applies within Part 519, the Canadian Tax Treaty. And when the Canadian Tax Treaty expired in 1993, it was replaced with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which terminated all taxation between the two countries. So it ended. The government's authority to tax you in Canada ended because the NAFTA doesn't allow for tax. And NAFTA has since expired and been replaced by Trump with the MCA and Mexico-Canadian America, the tax treaty. So there's no more application at law that is live of Section 61 because it fell off the books in 93 when the original legislation expired. So I think that if you look it up today, you'll find that in 2005, the government decided to publish an application of Section 61 to Part 1. Unfortunately, Congress didn't do that. That's regulatory deference under Chevron. The IRS making up another regulation to support the unconstitutional de facto administration of the tax as a financial extortion tool to steal and rule and control the American people, rather than to represent them through the collection of legitimate constitutional taxation, where all direct taxes are apportioned to the states for payment, and all indirect taxes must be uniform, and where there is no allowance or provision for the graduated taxation of the American people. Graduated taxation discriminates against the American people on the basis of productivity and wealth. It is unconstitutional for Congress to discriminate against the American people. Graduated tax brackets, if you research it, go back to a series of Supreme Court decisions in the late 1870s, 80s, that allowed for the use of graduated tax brackets based on the power of Congress to discriminate against the inanimate commodities and articles of commerce subject to tax. And I would add, to discriminate against the inanimate corporate person, the privileged licensed person, and the privileged foreign person, where we find the tax applicable. And as I've said before, income isn't the object of the tax nor the subject of taxation. It's the mechanism that measures the amount of tax owed on the earnings derived from the federally taxable transactions or activity subject to an imposed duty or excise. But if there's no imposed duty or excise to measure, you don't just tax the yardstick and tax everything the man made. That's not indirect taxation by granted authority. That's direct taxation through perverted sedition and subversion of the Constitution through a misapplication of the 16th Amendment, which can't possibly be construed as authorizing a direct tax. By an honest person, it can't be construed because the word direct isn't in the amendment. Everywhere else that the Constitution addresses a power to tax directly, the word direct is part of the provision. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned amongst the several states. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4, no capitation or other direct tax shall be authorized unless laid in proportion to the census. Everywhere else, direct is present, but not in the 16th Amendment. The judges made it up. And this making it up perverted the income tax from a lawful constitutional indirect tax on corporations, licenses, commodities, foreigners, and in foreign places, like territories, possessions, and in foreign countries under tax treaties. It perverted that indirect and constitutional application, which is actually what's in the statutes. They perverted it and turned it into this unconstitutional fraud of a direct tax on the labor and everything an American citizen does. Baloney. No. Fraud. And Moore, the Supreme Court, has thrown away the fraud. They've exposed it. They've explicitly said that income taxes are indirect. Okay, I think I hear the second commercial break coming up. We'll be back with more in the last 15-minute segment in 5. This is Thomas Freed on the LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com website. Get signed up, and I'll be back in 5 with more. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and let's just go ahead and get right back into this. So, as I've been explaining for, about 10 years now, the federal courts are the ones responsible for this sedition. The circuit courts have specifically been the ones that have made up this nonsense about the income tax is not a portion direct tax on all persons and all earnings under authority of the 16th Amendment. This is just absolute fraud. The circuit courts made it up, and the Supreme Court, previous to this one, allowed this judicial sedition that amounts to a rebellion and a virtual insurrection within the federal judiciary that has been allowed by the previous Supreme Courts to go on unaddressed, undermining the constitutional freedom and liberty of the American people while empowering the government far beyond the authorities that they're actually granted to exercise. There is no authority for agriculture. That's a state function. What's the Department of Agriculture doing? There is no authority for energy. That's a state function. There is no authority for education. Why do any of these federal agencies exist? I'll tell you why they exist. They exist to control you, to rule you, to intervene and inject themselves into every area of society in our lives, to interfere with the state government's operation within the states, to seize control by funding agriculture in the states. But only if you grow what we fund. Can't grow what grows in the state. Can only grow corn or sugar. Can't grow anything else. We'll only give you money for corn or sugar. Education. Oh, you don't get any money unless you teach CRT and gender dysmorphia and let boys use the girls' bathroom and put Tampax dispensers in the boys' bathrooms? Oh, there's a judicious use of school funding with the quality of education they're doing. That's exactly where we need to spend the money in the schools. You're absolutely right. So this is where it all comes from. The income tax robs you and enslaves you and provides the funding that lets the federal government get involved in all of these areas. Agriculture, commerce, labor, health and human services, housing, transportation, energy, education, environmental protection, occupational safety. None of these things are federally authorized activities for the federal government to spend money on. They need to go away. And this actually, in my opinion, gives you the opportunity to kind of fix the economy in America, because part of the problem is that all this money is being spent from only one place, D.C. And it's not being spent on the people in the 50 states. It's being spent on the D.C. contracting community and the bureaucrats and the lobbyists and the employees of the government, which keeps getting bigger and eating the budget. And all the money is distributed out of one city. And that, of course, has bred corruption to the max within the federal government. Now, I believe part of the solution, one that could be done right now by Trump, is abolishing every single one of these government agencies. Just shut them down. It's over. There's no authority for any of them. Close them down. Make them like a 10-person office inside the Department of the Interior. Get rid of 99%. Fire them all. And then, of course, what you do is you take all the budget dollars that would have gone to those federal agencies, and you distribute those budget dollars proportionately to the state governments, cut by, I would say, 10%, Because the way you balance the federal budget, the way you get back to fiscal sanity is you balance the federal budget. And the way you balance the federal budget is you cut it across the board 5 to 7% every single year until the budget is balanced. Nothing goes up, 5% across the board until it's balanced. The easiest way to do that would be to take all of these government agency budgets and cut them by the 5% that everything else gets cut, and then cut those agency budgets by another 5% and distribute those funds, proportionate under the census, to the states so that all 50 states get dollars to spend on agriculture, energy, industry, education, transportation, housing. Each state can spend the money out of its own capital that's distributing the spending and stimulating economy in 50 different states instead of stimulating corruption in one national capital. So all of this money goes to the states. The first year they'll get more because every year after that it's going to be cut till the budget's balanced or the funding is eliminated entirely, ultimately, possibly. But until the budget's balanced, they're going to get a smaller amount every year. So the first year you put in place the infrastructure to manage your energy, education, agriculture, and all the other things. You're being given money to manage with the state level for the first time. And then every year after that, you're going to get less money. So you build it out the first couple of years and then use the reduced funds to keep it staffed after that. But it puts control in the states. It lets the states have the capital to stimulate economy in each of their states rather than all of it being spent in Washington, D.C. on national, multinational corporate contractors that are taking the money and cheating us out of service. Because just look at what they did with the last few things, right? They took how many billions to deliver what? 7 recharging stations? And was it 42 billion to distribute internet to the rural? But so far they've done hardly anyone, and they're doing it at the cost of 100,000 a connection because they canceled Starlink's contract to do it for 1,000. Because Musk needs to be looked at. So they immediately canceled the contract to the one company that was actually capable of doing it. Unbelievable. And nobody's gotten internet. 42 billion for no service. Everything the federal government does is corrupt and overspent. It should all be money spent out of the state capitals, and the states will decide whether they need windmills, solar panels, gas production, a pipeline, or oil. Let the state governments decide these policies within each state. These are not federal matters, and the fact that they have become federal matters is part of the reason why the federal government rules everything we have and everything that's done. It's why Joe Biden can interfere in a pipeline project or a wall project funded by Congress. He's not supposed to be able to break the law. The whole last 4 years has been nothing but policies of breaking the law. Oh, we need new immigration law. No, you don't. You need to enforce the law we have. Oh, but we don't want to enforce the law we have. We need new law. No, you don't need new law. The problem is not that you don't have law. The problem is the government refused to enforce it because it wanted to let in what it thought would be blue voters, but nobody from Cuba. Cubans know about socialism. They vote red. So no Cubans. Only everybody else, too ignorant to speak English or understand the difference between freedom and the enslavement that dependence results in. So, this has all come about because the federal courts haven't done their job. They violated their oaths. They betrayed the American people. They perpetrated this sedition of enforcing the communism of the second plank of the Communist Manifesto rather than constitutional taxation. Why do I say that? Well, what's the second plank of the Communist Manifesto? It reads, and I quote, a heavy, progressive, or graduated income tax. That's where you find class warfare of graduated taxation. Divide the population into different classes, write different law for them, and watch them spend the rest of their existence fighting the other half of the population instead of the unconstitutional control that the government effects out of having a class warfare system where both sides of the war, the entire population, are all calling out to the government to step in and intervene and write more law to control the other class. Don't write law to tax us, the poor. Tax the rich. Oh, don't write law to tax us. We're already paying all the tax. Yeah, right. And of course, that's what's happened. Since the end of World War II, you've had essentially a class warfare system that is the pendulum swinging back and forth, to favoring the rich, to favoring the poor, to taxing the rich, to favoring the poor. And it's all unconstitutional. The Constitution requires uniform taxation, and the Congress has no authority to discriminate against the American people. According to this theory, that uniformity means the tax has to be geographically uniform, means it has to operate with the same legal effect everywhere that it operates, which means it's okay to tax the rich differently from the poor as long as you tax the rich in California and the poor in California the same as you tax the rich and the poor in New York. Okay, well, let's explore this theoretical theory, this possibility. So it's okay to tax the American people differently as long as the groups we tax are treated the same in each state. So does that mean we could tax Jews at 90% and Christians at 5%? How about blacks? Could we tax blacks at 10% and whites at 90%? How about Muslims? Could we tax Muslims at 100% and Christians at 0%? How about, could we tax the old at 2% and the young at 75%? How about men? Can we tax them at 80% and women at 20%? How about Italians? Can we tax Italians at 80% and the Irish at 30%? Or the Mexicans at 20%? Or Canadians at 10%? Or the Chinese at 90%? Can we discriminate against the people on any of these bases? No, of course not. You can't tax the black differently than the white, or the Jew different from the Christian, or the Italian different from the Irishman, or the man different from the woman, or the young different from the old, or the gay different from the straight. You can't treat these people differently in any law, including tax law. So where the hell do they get off taxing the rich different from the poor? Oh, it's okay as long as we treat them the same in each state. It's all okay as long as we treat them okay in the state. Bull. The whole thing's a fraud. It's communism. It's how you're being ruled and controlled by an ever-expanding bureaucracy that will never go away or get smaller until you take away the funding. We need to remove and terminate the income tax. It doesn't work. Both terminate it on both individuals and corporations and replace it with a corporate earnings tax of 4 to 5% on everything the company does. No deductions for expenses. 5% of everything that crosses the corporate register. Pay it in every single month. At the end of the year, file a return consolidating the annual earnings to make them match with your published annual reports for the shareholders. Corporate taxation. Abolish the Internal Revenue Service and reconstitute it as the Corporate Revenue Service to go with the External Revenue Service that he's creating to collect the tariffs. That way we'll know it's not the people that are being taxed, it's the corporations and the foreign business. Because that's what's in the Constitution, and that's what's in the original Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act, the income tax. It was foreign legislation. It was never domestic. That's what a tariff is. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. We'll be back next week with more. Stay tuned. Watch the Thomas Freed videos on the YouTube channel, and go over to taxfreedom.com and start getting educated. We'll be back next week with more.